Chapter 5, Section 1. Our Genetic Emotional History of Men. Throughout the previous small chapter, we described the general meaning of genetics, and we discussed how extremely important this subject of genetic adaptation is, because it recognizes how all species of life evolved, and especially how our own human life evolved. Because our past ancestors' emotional events have played an enormous role in the way our ancestors have inherited our genetic emotions throughout millions of years that have become stored in certain areas in our brain. So what emotional events have our male ancestors gone throughout our human history that were totally unlike the emotional events of our female ancestors? Men have protected us, protected our families, our homes, our countries. Men have been the main breadwinners in society, have brought us warmth, food, comfort, homes and financial support. And throughout history, men have supplied and brought us new thoughts and innovative ideas. And most of our great thinkers came from our men friends, such as philosophers, scientists, artists, mathematicians, physicians, astronomers, academics, explorers, physicists, architects, writers, poets, to name just a few. And let's not forget also all of the great men who have kept us all alive through their practical skills, such as our farmers, growers, builders, plumbers, electricians, etc. All of our very important hard-working men, and I am sure that I have left out hundreds of important men out of this list, and I apologise if you or any of your male ancestors have not been credited. However, you are not overlooked and should all be credited for all of the hard work throughout millions of years of our human history. However, we are forgetting another important aspect that our male ancestors have brought to our lives: the physical and emotional bravery, courage and strength to protect our lives throughout thousands, even millions of years, through protecting our countries and families from hundreds of different invasions. We cannot dismiss this as unimportant, because throughout millions of years, many of our men friends have experienced some of the worst atrocities, conflicts, battles, wars, and so much destruction and suffering with each other. But now we must all also start to be just as brave as all of our past masculine ancestors, so that we can take a few minutes to reflect back in past history, because it's difficult for us all to go back in time for thousands, even millions of years, because we think that it's not part of us, not part of our recent history in our modern world today. But genetically, our ancestors have passed on to us all emotional information through our genes. And so our past is most definitely relevant in our present lives today. And so we must all be courageous and ask ourselves, why are we still continuing to experience throughout our world all different kinds of fear, aggression, violence, pain, suffering, distrust, and continued separation with each other? We can only answer this if we are courageous enough to assess all of mankind's past history and acknowledge that most of these events involved our male ancestors, who played the main role in these hundreds of different conflicts, battles, wars, and all of these different invasions and atrocities with each other. Therefore, what are males today carrying through their genes, picked up through many of our past ancestors' emotional activities? And how have these particular emotional activities acted out throughout millions of years to influence a slight genetic increase in the development in certain genetic area in our brain? At the same time, we must also ask ourselves, how will these genes be passed on to all future generations of male offspring born? But before we begin, however, we must first remind ourselves of some very important past discussions written throughout this book so far. First, that our brains are highly complex, and that all men and all women have the same brain areas as each other, even if some of these particular areas in our brain may differ slightly in size, because of these different male ancestors' emotional events that were entirely different to our female ancestors' emotional events. Second, we must remember the discussions mentioned in Chapter 3, that only some individuals that have developed extreme ego-driven behavioural patterns have the capacity to take over control of all logical and rational information stored in the long-term memory to activate these extreme genetic emotions that we are going to discuss throughout this small chapter. Thirdly, we all carry our ancient ancestors' genetic emotions that can be found in our genetic memory, all men and all women. And fourth, it would be very beneficial to briefly refer back to the previous chapter to remind ourselves of how extremely unrecognizable some of these genetic emotions have been evolving throughout millions of years in these particular areas in our brain. But this is the reason why they are still influencing our human emotions and behavioural patterns even in our modern world today. So let's briefly give a small explanation of what emotions were activated in the brains of some of our male ancestors when all of these different conflicts, battles and wars throughout our human history began to escalate, and what emotions and behaviours did our male friends activate. Throughout our human history, most of our masculine historical leaders spent most of their very early childhood years being schooled, groomed and trained either by parents or guardians to act like a man, show no emotional fear, and be courageous and brave warriors in adulthood. Some were even forced to grow up too early in childhood to face a great deal of hardship and suffering, just like the life of Genghis Khan and Adolf Hitler, for instance. And this developed such extreme ego emotions throughout childhood that they became a sickness in their long-term memories. And this is how, by the time they got to adulthood, their extreme ego behaviours were now out of control of all logical, rational information stored in their long-term memories, and could only activate these more serious genetic emotions that had become stored in their genetic ancient ancestors' primitive genetic memory, the amygdala, that stores extreme fear, extreme aggression, or even extreme physical violent actions. This is because we must not forget one extremely important point, that whatever is stored into our long-term memories since very early childhood is who we become. This is how some of our masculine historical leaders throughout our human history could not even recognize that they had developed such extreme ego behavioral patterns. This is why it's very important that we should never ever underestimate the power, strength and control of some historical leaders' extreme adult ego behavioural patterns, because throughout our human history, this is how these extreme ego behavioural patterns had the power, strength and control to rally all of their troops and followers to go into battle. And once our male ancestors were taken into any kind of conflict situation, such as a battle, a war, or any other conflict emotional event that caused our male ancestors to take physical or aggressive violent action, our male ancestors' extreme adult ego behavioural patterns were now also fired up, so much so that they took over control of all rational and logical information that was stored in the long-term memory, that activated some of mankind's more serious, aggressive and violent primitive genetic emotions found in our genetic memory. This genetic memory is the memory that has stored all of our past ancestors' more serious and extreme genetic emotions that were used through all of these thousands of different wars and atrocities with each other, and that caused such emotional action as extreme fear, extreme aggression, and even extreme physical violence. Because this genetic memory that neuroscience experts refer to as the amygdala is our primitive memory that dates back millions of years, and this is why this genetic memory has stored many of our ancient ancestors' more primitive genetic emotions and behavioural patterns. Remember in the previous chapter when we explained how our ancestors have transmitted specific emotions through their genes and through the different male and different female emotional events and activities that our ancestors have gone through throughout millions of years of our human history, and that this emotional information has become stored in certain areas in our brain and differs slightly in size depending on our gender. Scientists refer to this as our epigenetic memory that can be given to us either through cellular memory, transcriptional memory, or transgenerational memory. Epigenetics controls genes. This is achieved through nature. Epigenetics is what determines a cell's specialization, for example, skin cell, blood cell, hair cell, liver cells, etc. As a fetus develops into a baby through gene expression, active or silencing dormant, and nurture, environmental stimuli can also cause genes to be turned off or turned on. As we already mentioned in the previous chapter. But how did this physical aggression take place? In other words, how did our male ancestors activate their fearful and aggressive genetic memory whenever they were ready to go into battle to fight their invaders or even invade themselves? This is a little complex because it has everything to do with two different types of our human emotions and behavioural patterns, but always began with the firing up of our ego emotions that, remember, are stored in our long-term memories. Most neuroscience experts refer to this area in our brain, the long-term memory, as the hippocampus. You will find a few references to the hippocampus in the index for chapters 1, 2 and 3. However, most neuroscience experts know that the hippocampus is connected in our brain to our genetic memory, the amygdala. But in order to activate the amygdala, our ancestors, once going into battle, had to first fire up their ego emotions, because once their fearful or aggressive ego emotions became so fired up that they took over control in the long-term memory, their ego emotions would trigger the amygdala that contained extreme fearful or extreme aggressive violent behavioural actions to take place. But remember that none of this could take place without the ego emotions taking over control in the long-term memory. This is how, throughout many millions of years, men have seen a slight increase in size in this particular area in our brain, the genetic memory, simply because men have activated this area in their brain much more frequently then women throughout all of these hundreds of different conflicts, battles, wars, and atrocities that men have experienced with each other throughout millions of years of our human history. This is why we mentioned earlier that currently our very early childhood, unknown, involuntary, illogical, irrational, ego, fear, or hurt emotions are some of the most highly influential set of emotions and behaviours that can be found in any area in our brain, because only the development of some extreme adult ego behavioural patterns have the capacity to activate some of these more serious genetic emotions that have genetically developed and have been stored in this area in our brain that some neuroscience experts refer to as our genetic memory, also called the amygdala. This is why, in many previous chapters, we have taken a great deal of time to discuss our own set of personal, individual, and different ego emotions, because it can never be emphasized enough that none of us should ever underestimate the power, control, and strength that our ego emotions have over all other emotions stored in any other area in our brain. We must also be reminded, however, that all women and all men all have this genetic area stored in our brain, the amygdala, because the amygdala is connected to our long-term memories. And this is why, in extreme circumstances, whenever our ego emotions become so outraged, upset, angry, hurt, aggressive, or having any other different, extreme, and out of control ego emotional wounds or suffering, our ego emotions can sometimes activate some of these more serious and more aggressive or even physical violent genetic emotions that are stored in this area in our brain, the amygdala. Imagine now that you were one of these brave men living in past history and you were told to go out to the front line of some particular war, battle, or aggressive and violent conflict, emotional action. You were told to join up and fight for king or country, and so you were taken off to war, not knowing if you would ever return to see your wife, your children, your mother, your father, or any of your family members ever again. This was the first of these emotional fears that these men had to face. The second emotional fear came with every day at the front line of aggression, killing and fighting, thinking that it might be the last day alive, and that any minute now your life may be taken, killed in battle. The fear of this happening must have been unbearable. The third emotional fear would have been having to kill your enemy. How many men do you think enjoyed killing other men? But men fought with courage, honour and bravery, and so these brave soldiers had to face these fears and go out to be at the front line of fighting wars and battles, etc., and literally enacted emotional aggression and violence on each other, and literally sacrificed their lives in order to defend their homes, their countries, come what may. Not to mention the after effects of war, the physical and sometimes permanent wounds that many men, had to endure, becoming permanently maimed and injured, losing arms, legs, shell shock, permanent head injuries, and all sorts of different after effects of emotional scars and wounds that were a permanent remembrance that became ingrained into their long-term memories. However, these were the lucky ones, because this only happened if our ancestors were lucky enough to have survived these horrific atrocities with each other. This is how each new conflict, battle, war, throughout thousands of centuries, began to activate this particular genetic area in our male ancestors' brain, the amygdala, through millions of our male ancestors, different, extreme fearful, extreme physical aggressive, and even extreme violent emotional behaviours with each other. And once activated, this triggered neuroplasticity to install even more aggressive and violent emotional behaviours to become stored into this area in our brain, our ancient ancestors' primitive genetic memory. And this is how these extreme and traumatic emotional experiences created a slight genetic increase in size throughout each generation to become stored into this area in our male ancestors' brain, the amygdala. And this is how each new generation of male babies born would have inherited this slight increase in size in this genetic memory, the amygdala. If we took the time to reflect, we would recognise that there has been thousands of different aggressive or violent conflicts, battles or wars of some kind or another that our male ancestors have taken action in, all over our world throughout the past millions of years. And because of this reason, there has not been many of our male ancestors who were not involved in some kind of serious acts of physical aggression and violence with each other. We all know this. However, to remind us, there is a brief description of many of these different historical dates written in the index at the end of chapter 4 at the back of this book. This list is by no means an accurate, complete and full list. However, it gives us a pretty good idea that men have been fighting wars and conflicts with each other for as far back as mankind can possibly remember. Therefore, if we are courageous enough to allow our own set of ego emotions to accept these facts, we can learn by all of our ancestors' past mistakes throughout our human history, and we can also recognise that all these physical, aggressive and violent actions with each other have most definitely affected the development in certain areas in our human brain, and therefore will have most definitely affected the direction of evolutionary development at the genetic level today. As we mentioned in the previous chapter, we are all made up of our own very special human DNA, called the genome. This means that we all carry within our DNA special encoded information and instructions within our genes that are produced to make us all become the human beings we all are today. And all animals, all creatures, all plants, all trees, all living organisms, and all that belongs to all Earth's nature also have their own special genome, because each species carries within their DNA their own special encoded information and instructions within these genes that makes them develop their own individual species. This is why, to become a human, we all had to have our own special genetic human encoded set of instructions. This is called our human DNA. And these special DNA instructions are passed from parent to their offspring. This is why humans can only evolve into humans, and birds can only evolve into birds, donkeys into donkeys, trees into trees, etc. In other words, all species that belongs to all Earth's nature can only evolve into their own special species. And this is how, in humans, each male offspring born received special encoded instructions from his father, and each female offspring also receives special encoded instructions from her mother, as you will soon discover in the next chapter. However, each male and female offspring receives almost similar encoded instructions from both mother and father, and have almost the same DNA encoded instructions that make us all human. However, the only difference between the male offspring and female offspring is that there is a genetic difference in our male and female reproductive organs. This is a very well-known biological fact. As mentioned earlier, all classifications of species of animals and all living creatures on land and in our oceans, and all classifications of species of plants also have their own individual set of special encoded instructions of DNA called the genome, including all humans. And this is how, when we were all at the embryo level, these genetic encoded instructions meant that all humans began to grow arms, legs, hair, a head, feet, toes, a nose, mouth, lips, eyes, etc. In other words, we are all the same at the human genetic level, except for the difference in our male and female sexual organs, of course. And this is how women differ from men, because this is when women develop different encoded instructions of XX chromosomes, and men developed different encoded instructions of XY chromosomes that differ and reproduce different sexual organs. And these exact genetic encoded instructions, found in all of our human DNA, is acting out in all of our internal structures inside our bodies and inside our brains. And this is why, genetically, all humans, all men and all women have evolved all the same internal organs, such as a heart, a bladder, a stomach, intestines, lungs, spleen, and all other organs, etc. And this is why, at the same time, genetically, all men and all women have also evolved all these different internal complex brain areas. For instance, we all have a cerebrum that is divided into 4 lobes: cerebellum, the brainstem, amygdala, corpus callosum, and all other complex brain areas, such as the development of all of our different memories, such as our long-term memory, short-term memory, working memory, etc. And the more we research all of these different complex areas in our brain, we find that attached to our long-term memories, that by the way stores all and only our personal information, attached to our long-term memories, we have all genetically evolved our ancient ancestors' primitive genetic memory, the amygdala, including myself, given to us and inherited by all of our ancestors' genetic emotions, and genetically passed on to us all through our genes. Through searching for independent scientific research evidence that concerns this slight size difference in this genetic area in men's brains, the amygdala, I found only a very few very old research papers that identify that this part of our brain, the amygdala, is associated with emotionally aggressive and fear-based behaviours. And most of these research papers were based on experiments concerning animal behaviours. I have not included these research papers as references in this index, as it is against my ethical principles that we experiment on animals for our own human advancement, because all animals deserve the same respect as all humans. At the same time, there is no correlation between the brains of animals and our own human emotional activities carried out throughout our human history. As mentioned earlier, I did, however, find one independent scientific research paper that clearly shows this slight size difference in this area in men's brains, the amygdala. However, this research paper is relating to sexual differences between men and women's emotional behaviours, and these research studies do not give any reasons for this slight size difference, only that this slight size difference exists. Therefore, for the sake of our own global collective future, we must ask a brand new team of neuroscience experts to release all extreme ego competitive and ego power struggles and begin to work together to help all of mankind identify and find further evidence for these particular findings discussed throughout this chapter. Because we must all now begin to take this information much more seriously, because many of us are now becoming fully aware that our ancestors' genetic emotions are now beginning to repeat themselves. This is the reason that I would like to draw your attention to a very small piece of independent science experts' neuroscience coursework that will be listed at the back of this book. Function of the amygdala. Stimulation of the amygdala causes intense emotions such as aggression or fear. Fear conditioning, an example of the role of the amygdala in learning. This amygdala memory system serves as an example of memory systems generally. The establishment of memories is a function of the entire network, not any single component. The amygdala is involved in a kind of primitive emotional memory, one that is likely preserved by evolution. As mentioned earlier, we cannot dismiss this as unimportant because throughout millions of years, many of our men friends have experienced some of the worst atrocities, conflicts, battles, wars, and so much destruction and suffering with each other. But now we must all also start to be just as brave as all of our past masculine ancestors, so that we can take a few minutes to reflect back in past history, because it's difficult for all of us to go back in time for thousands, even millions of years, because we think that it's not part of us, not part of our recent history in our modern world today. But genetically, our ancestors have passed on to us all emotional information through our genes, and so our past is most definitely relevant in our present lives today. In the next chapter, we are now going to discuss the differences between our female ancestors' emotional history and the different emotional activities and events that influence the development of some of our ancient ancestors' female genetic emotional behaviours.